First of all, thanks to Melina and Harry for inviting me and for organizing this, and to all of you for attending. Especially, I want to thank Geeta Johar, my friend and colleague, and I'm very honored to be sharing the stage with her today. As you can see, the paper I'm going to talk about is a co-authored piece of work, co-authored with Harry Mamaysky, the director of the PFS, and also one of our former students, who's now a professor at Imperial College, Roka Yang. The paper, as you can see from the title, is about measuring the cost of regulation. I want to say two things as caveats to begin with. Notice that I won't be talking about the benefits of regulation. So we won't be providing any kind of general sort of overall social welfare calculation about whether regulations do more harm than good or anything like that. Our goal in this presentation is simply to try to gauge what the costs are to the regulated firms, not what the benefits and perhaps other costs are to others in the economy. The other caveat that I want to give, and I have to apologize to Evan, who's already on. He probably thought I was going to talk something about financial institutions, because I do a lot of talking about financial institutions regulation. But in this paper, we are specifically excluding financials because the regulatory world for financial and non-financial firms is very different. And the kinds of tools that we're developing here will have to be sort of recalibrated and done specially for financial institutions. And we are planning to do that. But today, I'm neither going to talk about the benefits of regulation, nor am I going to talk about financial institutions. So let's get started. Whoops, looks like I have a frozen screen. I'm going to have to unshare and share again. So the goal that we set for ourselves was to come up with a measure that allows us to see at the firm level, preferably, but possibly even at the sectoral level, some notion of regulatory costs, so that you can actually look at which firms, which industries are affected by what kinds of regulatory policies and changes over time in regulatory policy. Ideally, when we think about regulation, we want to be all-encompassing. And I want to mention, this is especially a problem in the last 30 years for a couple of reasons. One, of course, is that regulation is no longer just formal rulemaking. In fact, since the 1970s, there's been a dramatic increase in what's called regulatory guidance, which are regulations where the government agency that's in charge of a particular area might notify either generally in public or through some other means. If, let's say, it's bank regulators, they'll notify banks that they have decided that they're interpreting something a new way. Unlike the Administrative Procedures Act kinds of regulations, formal rulemaking, under guidance, you don't have to ask for comments, and you don't have to delay and try to incorporate comments. And so regulators, it appears, since the 1970s, have been preferring the use of guidance because there's less accountability. There's also less formal sort of enumeration of rules. And what that means is that it's especially hard in the last 30 years to try to track federal rules and their importance for firms. But it's not just that, there are other problems. Globalization means that firms care not just about regulations coming from the federal government in the US, but all regulations coming from maybe from other countries. And of course, state and municipal governments have regulations too that could matter. And more importantly than any of those caveats, of course, the fact that regulations, even if the ones that are written on the books, we don't know how important they are. We don't know how costly they are. And as I'll talk about in a minute, most of the techniques that have been used implicitly assume that all words about regulation are equally costly. And so the way people have up till now been thinking about trying to incorporate these kinds of measures is just counting up formal rules. Problem with counting up formal rules, of course, is, first of all, it's just federal. It's not state, it's not local, it's not international. It doesn't have anything from guidance in it. And furthermore, it doesn't really tell you whether the words are important. And I'll give you a little bit of evidence just to get started about why we think that that latter point is especially important. So actually, Harry and Roca and I started writing this paper a few years ago. We thought we would use the George Mason University measures of regulation, which are sectoral measures, which are based on just counting up words of formal regulation, the kind that are passed under the Administrative Procedures Act. GMU, as I say here, has an impressive project, has used very state-of-the-art sort of natural language processing techniques to be able to differentiate over time and according to the relevance to all three-digit sectors of the total federal formal rulemaking word flow that happens over the course of a year. And I think now they're even doing it quarterly. But as I said, this doesn't capture guidance, state regulations, foreign regulations, nor does it measure importance. And our first clue that this importance issue was quite relevant came from our analysis of the last several years. So here's a graph that you can see. If you take the George Mason, again, formal federal rulemaking, and you look at whether it's the mean or the weighted mean, and you see it's incredibly smooth. This is the aggregate, but each of the sectors also is quite smooth. And then if you look from 2016 to 2017, the first year that Trump was in office, you get the impression that there's really, if you look at that average, you can see that according to this, there was no change. In other words, the total number of regulatory words that were relevant coming out of their measure for the typical industry was pretty much unchanged. In fact, maybe even accelerating a little bit. If they had two different measures, I won't go into the fine points because it doesn't matter. And you can see that under this alternative measure, again, if anything, it seems to be accelerating a little bit in 2017, but basically it's constant. Now that's a little strange because I'll show you now some evidence that clearly there's been, by many measures, in the aggregate, a pretty important change in regulations or reduction in regulations. So one thing to look at is, this is a George Washington University measure, and if they keep track of the number of economically significant final rules published, and economically significant means that according to cost-benefit analysis that they do, that these are just formal rules, but how many of them have a cost of greater than $100,000, I think it is, or it's 100 million, I forget what their standard is. But as you can see by this measure, 2016 saw economically significant final rules plummeting. So now that's really strange because the George Mason University measure is a measure of total word flow in the formal regulatory rule book. But you can see that it's a quite dramatic difference if you weight by importance. Furthermore, if you look at the George Mason study is using the top graph here, which is the Code of Federal Regulations. But if you use the Federal Register, which includes a lot of other actions rather than just the federal regulations passed into code, again, you do see a decline. And that reflects, I think, things like executive orders and other kinds of measures. So the point is, our formal rule-based measures based on counting up words or trying to somehow count things in the aggregate leads to very different kinds of measures. And of course, if you're trying to do something at the level of individual firms, you want to differentiate, but you want to have a measure that's sort of coherent and makes sense. So we ended up concluding that mainly because these measures are incomplete and also because they don't really tell us much about importance, they're not very useful for gauging how regulations actually have costs for firms. Just to give you a little bit of color, here's a survey that shows that when Trump took office, many small businesses changed if you look at the red versus the gray, what you see there is when it talks about how important government regulation is as a business concern, you can see that there was a sharp decline in the first year of the Trump administration in the percentages of businesses that were saying this was an important problem for them that they had to overcome. So again, from the standpoint of businesses, we have some pretty strong subjective evidence that regulatory costs are falling. But how do we actually quantify that and see how it matters for firms, and in particular differentiating across firms? There are some attempts to look at particular aspects of firms. There's a paper by Simkovich and Zhang, but what they're doing is they're focusing on things like numbers of employees that are employed in compliance. This is a great measure of some aspects of regulation, but it's a measure primarily of the physical costs of complying with regulation. It wouldn't capture, for example, forward-looking concerns about regulatory costs and regulatory risks that the firm might bear. That's going to be important because that's going to be a theme of my presentation today, that when you do try to capture in a very open-ended way the costs of regulation, what you find is that a lot of those costs seem to be about risk. So we're not against the Simkovich and Zhang study, but we're just saying it's only focusing on a kind of current compliance cost, not a sort of forward-looking and risk-related cost. So we think that there's an overarching way to look at regulations, and that is regulations are costly if firms talk about them in a way that makes it seem like they're costly. And in particular, what we want to do is not just look at, as one study before us by Steve Davis and some other co-authors, another very nice study that looked at regulatory costs by looking at word analysis of firms' 10Ks. And there are some things that we have in common. We found some similarities to some of the things that they found in their paper. But what we thought made sense to do was to focus on earnings calls. And that means the transcripts from the conversations that happen on a quarterly basis between public firms and their investors. So in those transcripts, there are two parts. There's the presentation part where the executives present to the people who are tuned into the conversation their slide deck. And then there's the Q&A section. And this is something that we thought was particularly interesting about the earnings calls, is that they allow you to differentiate between what the sort of boilerplate is that the company is saying, which is somewhat similar to the 10Ks, let's say, the company's own presentation, as opposed to what the investors are asking. So for example, if companies might not want to talk about regulation or might want to talk about it in a way that might be excessively positive or want to put a good spin on it, then maybe the presentation section might not capture fully what we want to know. Whereas in the Q&A section, where investors get to decide what the questions are, if regulation is a concern, they'll be the ones bringing it up. So it seemed to us that by trying to use the discussions to do natural language processing, textual analysis of the actual word flow, to see how much the discussion is about regulation, and then to see whether it's thinking of regulation as increasing or decreasing, which is going to be a novel part of what we're going to do. We're actually not just going to track how often the word regulation is mentioned, but whether in the sentence, in the context of the mention of regulation, whether they're talking about it going up or down. And it does turn out that that's quite relevant, because some of the discussion is about it going up, some going down. And I'll tell you, we won't get to talk about all the nuances today, but that the coefficients for up and down are not statistically significantly different. So you do want to keep track of the fact whether regulation is being mentioned in the context of it rising or falling. So that's pretty much all the things I wanted to say. What we want to do here in terms of our overall introduction, what we're going to do is look at the transcripts of the earnings calls, analyze separately the presentation and the Q&A sections, and try to see how frequently there's a discussion about regulation. We're going to also make sure it's economic regulation, not sort of electrical engineering regulation or other kinds of meanings of the word regulation. Measure whether it's increasing or decreasing, and then see how that predicts things that are happening for the firms. For example, subsequent changes in profitability or in growth or in the stock price.
Professor, just to note, we have 5 minutes remaining for you.
Thanks. So I'm going to cut myself off at 20 minutes, and I apologize if I don't get through a lot of the details, but I think now I can tell you summary of our main findings. So our preferred measure, which is based on increasing and decreasing regulation, that what we find there is that there's a very large effect on sales growth. So a negative, if you have a standard deviation increase in this measure of regulatory change, that's associated with, on average, about a 1.5% decline in sales growth. By the way, that dissipates over a period of a couple of years, but it ends up being about a 2% decline on average. We also did some other results I'm not going to have a chance to talk about relating to more standard ways of using sentiment in the context of mentions of regulation, which have some similarities. But we think our net reg measure, which takes account of increasing, decreasing words, works better. So we found very large growth effects. No effects, though, on profitability. And third, we found very major effects on stock returns. And then the question is the effect on stock returns reflecting anticipated or unanticipated effects? Well, there are two reasons to think that it's reflecting anticipated effects. The first one is that the coefficient is positive. That is, when net reg is increasing, the returns required in the market go up, and they go up quite significantly. So that the annualized cost of capital for firms for a standard deviation increase in regulation by our measure implies a 3% increase in the cost of capital, which is enormous. And so we're finding very large effects, about a 2% decline in sales on average, about a 3% increase in the cost of capital. But we're also finding, quite interestingly, that for larger firms, and the effect of the sales growth decline is mitigated. In fact, the very largest firms have a zero effect. Now, this is a standard idea in the regulation literature, which is that large firms are better able to handle regulatory risk. So notice that we're not finding current profitability or expenses are going up. What we're finding is that the main effect of the regulation that we're capturing in our measure seems to be related to a risk, which causes both the cost of capital to go up and causes firms to shrink their growth. And then we think that's the most plausible interpretation of what we're finding, and that the effects are quite large. Now, there are a lot of other nuances. I know I don't have time to go through them all. And I'll just show you a couple of things in the graphs here. Notice that the P and the Q&A, P is the presentation, Q&A is the Q&A sections, really should be analyzed separately because they have pretty different trends and patterns. Although you can see both of them plummet in 2017. So we do get a sense that the change in regulation is very much in the form of a deregulation in 2017. So that's a nice thing we're able to capture. The trend in regulation is upward in terms of the total regulatory concept words. This isn't measuring net reg, this is just measuring the mentions of regulation, whether positive or negative. Another thing to mention here, and then this will probably be the last thing I'll have time for, is that if you look at the sentiment associated with regulation, which is another way, that is when regulations mentioned, are there positive sentiment words? That's different from increasing or decreasing. And you can see that in the Q&A section, also in 2017, when regulations mention, there are a lot more positive sentiment words, which is also consistent with what I said about the 2017 period being one of noticeable deregulation. We're probably about out of time. I don't really have anything else that's crucial for me to talk about. There's a lot of other pieces to this, but I'm just going to skip to the end and just say we have some pretty strong results for growth and risk that are suggestive that regulatory costs can be captured through natural language processing that focuses on the conversation between firms and their investors, and that the effects are very large. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.